What's up scavengers, and Scandinavia here. Hope you all had a wonderful winter holiday. I certainly have, since I finally got some time to build stuff for my ants. Which brings me to the topic of this video, a dirt setup for my Messor colony. I will go through how I made this setup, every single step, from cutting the glass to mixing the dirt. So stick around to the end if you want to know how to make a setup exactly like this. And let's get right into it. So, whilst you first watch me gauge the appropriate glass pieces in the background, I can explain why I chose to make a dirt setup for my Messor colony. You see, if you didn't know, my Messor colony recently got a huge upgrade in their setup, with a brand new outworld, a new nest, and a 10-meter tube spanning all across my room. Go check that video out too if you have not. After making that setup, however, I started seeing behaviors that I didn't really like. The ants started to nest inside of the tubing. This was actually because it was more humid there than in the actual nest. And that was my fault, since I didn't make the white-tongue nest with dirt inside it. Adding dirt inside a white-tongue nest make it hold humidity better, especially for vertical nests like this. I could also have made the water chambers larger and deeper, since it actually was a vertical nest and not a normal one. All this, combined with the fact that I don't really bother watering the nests every day, I figured to make a dirt setup, which was naturally moist. This way, the ants can have their eggs and larvae in that setup, since they require high humidity, whilst having their seed storage and pupa in the white-tongue nest. Adding a dirt setup would also make it possible for them to take dirt inside of the white-tongue nest when they need to raise the humidity in there. Another thing that I noticed with the old setup was that they had a really long way to go just to leave their trash and excrete waste. This made for some rather unpleasant spots in the tubing where they decided to have a communal toilet, as well as a ton of waste inside of the nest. Having waste inside of the nest is always a bad thing, since it might be prone to molding. Adding a dirt setup close to the white-tongue nest would eliminate this, since they would be able to leave the waste there. Not a guarantee, but they would at least have the chance to do so, as well as excrete their waste. In other words, the dirt setup would function 3 ways, if placed right next to the white-tongue nest. Number 1, it would serve as a more constant source of moisture for early stages of brood. Number 2, it would enable them taking dirt inside of the white-tongue nest. And number 3, it would serve as a trash station. Now that I have explained why I chose to make one, let's actually go through how I did so. As you have seen in the background here, I didn't really have that much glass to work with, so I made the setup fit the glass sheet and not the other way around. I started by making paper cutouts for the sizes that I wished for, then gradually making them smaller so that they all fit on the glass sheet I had available. The first step in making this setup is cutting glass, and for that you need 2 basic things: a glass cutter, 2 clamps, something straight, and a ruler of some kind. The first step is to place the glass you want to be cut on something soft, like a towel. Then adjust it so that where you want it to be cut is just in reach of the clamps. Place the straight thing, which I'm going to call a straight edge from here on out, across the glass piece. Also, a little side note, I'm using a metal straight edge here, and I've actually taped the underside so it doesn't scratch or crack the glass. Then, use the ruler to measure the length you want to cut, from the outer edge. Make sure to add an extra 1 to 3 mm to your measurement, depending on the tool you will be using to cut, since the actual cutting bit of the tool is often in the middle, therefore 1 to 3 mm away from the edge of the tool, which you're gonna drag against the straight edge. You will see what I mean soon. Of course, I accidentally failed to record when I made the first cut, but it turned out good. As you can see, the cutting line was in my case 2 mm from the straight edge. This is why you should add 1 to 3 mm depending on your glass cutter. And don't just pick a number 1 to 3, please measure the actual distance from the actual cutting bit to the edge of the tool. So when cutting glass, small shards spits out everywhere, so make sure to vacuum all around you made the cut. Now it's time to actually snap the glass. This step is pretty scary to do the first time, but if you follow these steps, it's extremely simple. What you have to do is place the glass piece on a hard edge, the edge of the table in this case, and have the line that would just cut right over that edge. Then hold one hand on the piece that is on the table, and the other piece with your other hand. Now for the actual snap. Make sure to straighten your arm and positioning your body close to 90 degrees or so above the cut. Then do a swift and very firm push with your entire body to get a clean and fast snap like so. The cleaner the line you cut in the previous step, the better the final result. Now for the next piece. We do the exact same thing here. I did choose to move in order to get a better angle for my clamp, but that's the only difference. This time I actually managed to hit the recording button when I made the cut, so now we can actually go over that more in detail. What you want to do is start with the cutter just outside the glass. Then firmly and smoothly with one single motion run it across, tight against the straight edge until you reach the end, where you continue across the edge. The gripping of the tool is very personal, and in my case can vary from cutting to cutting. What you have to know, however, is that you have force applied from almost straight above, and holding the tool in a very firm grip, whilst dragging it along the straight edge. As you can see here, I use my index finger to apply force, almost 90 degrees above the tool. Try it out first on some trash parts before making an important cut, to get the basics down, since it does require some practice to make a good cut. Alright, the next piece we don't really have to go over in detail since I just used the same method as I just went over. As a double check, make sure that the piece is the same width all across the sheet, in order for it to fit good with the final gluing. This next cut I failed. I wanted to get a good angle here so that you guys could see exactly how it was done, but instead I wavered the tool in the beginning. This is, however, a very good time to go over what to do if something like this happens, so let's just say that I failed for educational purpose. As you saw, I continued the cut, even though I knew I had failed. This is important, since it makes sure that you keep the momentum and prevents you creating more lines than you have to. What you want to do next is that you start over, but this time apply much greater force than before in order to make this new cut more of a stress point than the failed cut before. You do this by obviously pushing harder, but also make sure to drag the tool extra slow when connecting it to the rest of the cut. As you can see, now we have two stress points right next to each other. With this in mind, you have to be very careful placing the correct cut right over the edge of the table, as well as lining it up perfectly with the rest of the cut. Apply force swiftly in one motion, and if you're lucky, which I was in this case, you just save yourself from a considerable headache. Obviously, always try to avoid failing like I did here in the first place. Now for the drilling part. Drilling in glass is always hard, and I have personally not perfected my technique yet. What I do know from experience, however, is that you have to have practice, a lot of it. The hardest part of the cut is actually in the beginning, to actually get a cut in the glass to then just follow. Use some silver tape or other very strong thick tape over where you want to make the hole, like I did here, in order to create some guiders. This I have found is very useful. Here I tried to using masking tape since I figured it would also work, but it really failed on me, as you will see later. So please use silver tape or your available equivalent. What you then need is a pretty large bottle filled with water, with a tiny needle hole at the bottom. This is to create a constant stream of cooling water when you're drilling. Your worst enemy when drilling is getting the glass overheated, since then it would shatter 100%. When drilling, apply constant pressure until you think you're almost at the end, since you want to apply as little force as possible in the end, otherwise you will get a very ugly and unclean cut. And of course I managed to fail to do this, since I was a bit too stressed and didn't really realize when I was close to the other side. This made for a ton of shattered glass around the hole, something that would have been avoided if only I was a bit more calm and focused. As you can see, this hole is far from perfect. It is in fact the absolute worst glass cut hole I've ever drilled, and I was not pleased with it at all in fact. But I did have to make it do, however, since that was all the glass I had. But you know what? That wasn't the worst part of this build. We have just gotten started with the problems. I was casually just filming how to apply the tubing connector as you see here, and was then about to remove it off camera when I shattered the entire piece in half. I was so mad with myself, since it was totally my fault, and it was because of such a stupid mistake. Now I had a piece with the worst drilled hole ever broken in half, but I had no spare glass to make a new piece out of, so I had to fix it somehow. If you follow me at my Instagram at @answer_Scandinavia, you would probably already have known how I solved this, since I often post about my builds there whilst in the process of making them. Go follow me there if you want to see behind the scenes sneak peeks at my projects and my animals. Anyhow, I fixed the issue entirely off camera. Now it was time to make sure all the glass pieces had a fairly straight edge. As you can see, some sides were not completely straight. What you want to do then is identify where the uneven spot is, and then sand it down using fine gritted sandpaper and water. I used some P400 paper for this. Sand until the uneven spot is close to gone or gone completely. You don't have to be super exact with this, since the silicone will add 0.5 millimeter or so between the glass either way, but if it is a big uneven bump like I had here, it is good to sand it down a bit. Talking about silicone, let's glue this thing together. I have actually not mentioned this, but always take into consideration the thickness of the glass when planning the sizes of the sides, since the thickness have to be subtracted or added in some cases to the sides depending on how you plan your build. I chose to have all of my pieces standing on top of the bottom piece and not beside it, as well as having the front and back panels actually be in the absolute front and back. This made so that the side pieces are 8 mm thinner than the bottom piece, so it would all fit, since the glass thickness is 4 mm. As you might have noticed, I placed some clear tape on the cloth. This will make sense soon. Also, prepare some masking tape under each piece for stability during the actual assembly. For the mentioned assembly, I am using this aquarium silicone called Ilbruck GS202. This silicone is food grade safe when dry, so it should be ant safe too. I started siliconing the back edge against the pre-applied tape. This tape was added for the silicone to not get stuck on the towel. The side glass pieces are then placed on top of the front piece, and the masking tape is applied for stability. Side note, obviously I'm gluing this together laying down. So, everything is then checked off to be square with a metal piece that I had. This is a very important step, and you can use really whatever you have, but you have to make sure that it's completely 90-degree angle square. And what you do is that you press it into the corner, making sure that both the glass pieces are lined up perfectly 90 degrees. The bottom silicone lines were then smothered to decrease the possibility of ants biting off pieces, since they will most likely be nesting furthest down, as well as holding water better. I then let it sit dry for at least 24 hours or so, and it held up perfectly. Here you can see why I added the tape on the cloth, since the silicone would otherwise adhere to the cloth and could potentially get stuck. I cleaned up the spots where the new glass panel would go, and started siliconing. Added the panel and made sure it was well squared off at the bottom. Applying tape is not really necessary for this last step, since it's actually a top glass piece, but I did it anyways to stay safe. I then put a large bottle filled with water as I wait, and then waited another 24 hours. The next day, it was all ready. I took away the tape and started to clean the silicone on the edges. For some reason, I just love this step. Shaving off excess silicone is just so satisfying. So, I gave it a clean with some water and a microfiber cloth and sanded down the top edges a bit. Then, it was time for a water test, to see if there were any holes that needed to be filled. And it seemed okay. This tank won't hold water anyways, but always make sure to do a water test, since ants and small amount of dirt might leak out if you're not careful, as well as water of course if you overwater the setup. Next up was to make the shelving for this setup to actually go on. For this, I got help from my dad, who is much better at these things than I am. We drilled holes and inserted plugs and then screwed up the shelf. And just like that, it was there. I was super excited to get the ants moved in at this point, so I rushed the lid a bit, as you will see. I initially wanted to make a sliding door like I had done for their other Outworld, so I started to cut out pieces for that. Well, I can just speed through this part, since it turned out pretty bad, and on top of that, I accidentally broke this one too. Looking back, there was a lot of things that turned out bad for me for this build, but luckily all went well in the absolute end. As you see here, it broke. And in the most silly way. I was literally just holding it in my hand whilst walking and it snapped. Yeah, I know, I'm that unlucky. But I mean, in the end, it would simply never have worked either way, since it was too thin of a lid to make a good sliding door anyway. So instead, I chose to make a magnetic lid, which turned out much better in the end. So I guess I was lucky with my bad luck or something? For the magnetic lid, I first made the actual lid part, drilled a pretty off-center bad hole for the ventilation. I'm telling you, this build had so many annoying mistakes in it. I then glued some fine meshing on top and made some handles out of tubing. Next up was the lip, to go all around the edge of the setup. This I did mostly off camera, since I just had enough with this lid. I just wanted to get done with it. Anyhow, the next part is the important part, the magnets. I used neodymium magnets for this, since they are the only magnets strong enough to hold a lid like this in place, at least that I am aware of and that are still cheaply available. This process, gluing the magnet, is not that hard essentially, but you have to be very precise and cautious, so that the correct side lines up as well as all the other magnets match with each other. I avoided messing up with this part, thankfully, by simply gluing the magnets on the first piece, not worrying about polarity, but then on the second piece I really made sure to nail the polarity, as well as I placed the already done piece under the piece that I was going to glue the new magnets on, so that the magnets would attract and would get situated well with all the other magnets. It's a bit hard to explain, but I hope you understand. After that, I made some padding for the tank, in all the corners and in the center, to make sure it doesn't crack against some grains or scratches the table. After that, I inserted the connector you saw earlier, without cracking the glass this time. I've had you guys asking me what this connector is called, and I think the English word for it is cable gland? Please don't quote me on that, but it is used for outside waterproof wiring for electrical cables, and that's also why it holds our ant tubing so well. In any case, I attached it to the setup. Now it was finally time to fill this setup up with dirt. Mixing dirt for setups like this is always hard in my opinion, since you don't really know for sure what will be the best mix. I wanted to achieve an overall homogeneous mix, since so much dirt would be visible, but still have some larger pieces for the ants to use as sturdy building material. I also didn't want it to hold humidity too well, since I will not have a drainage layer in this setup. Taking all of this into consideration, and also what I had available at the time, I went with a mix of the following. Some of my scrap soil mix, if you could call it that, made out of wood pieces, mostly potting soil, and a bunch of beetle larvae leftovers from my frequent soil changes in their setups. This gave the mix all the needed larger bits and pieces that I talked about, but not too large, since I still wanted the mix to be homogeneous enough to not spot a clear difference through the glass. So I did make sure to pick out all the pieces that were just a bit too large for my taste. Then I added the obvious sand. This was to create a bunch of air pockets and to overall aerate the soil, so that mold would not grow too much. I then added some really rich potting soil that I had to up the overall volume of the mix. Finally, I added a bunch of gravel into the mix too, to add some more to the bits and pieces that I was talking about before, so that the ants' structures would hold better, as well as increasing the air pockets. And that was basically it. I added some more sand and it was go time. I wanted the entrance to go below the ground level, so that they would have to build more naturally, aka a tunnel from the ground up leading up to the surface. I wanted to kinda recreate their behavior when they peek and guard their entrances like they do in the wild, so hopefully this will enable just that. Since the tank was so thin, I made a slope, and that was really all with escape that I did. And now recording this, looking back, this was all going to be for nothing. And I did have a hunch about that, since these ants are known to terraform anything they are given, but I still wanted it to look good for a little while at least. And in the end, now looking back, they really did surprise me with the speed of their terraforming. So the effort of the escape was pretty much for nothing, as you will see later. Anyway, let's finish this build for real now, by gluing on the lid onto the setup. Side note, I chose to glue on the lid after I made the scape, since it's easier to scape without a lip. Siliconing acrylic onto glass, using aquarium silicone as I am here, never works alone. So, what you have to do to make sure it holds is to use a primer like this. I use Sika Multiprimer Marine for this. I do want to stress a disclaimer here. This stuff is actually very toxic and flammable, so please do handle it with great care and/or with a guardian close at hand. I want to say that I am by no means responsible for any of the bad consequences that may occur when you are using this. With that out of the way, let's get going. To do this step, you need to have a scrap cloth like I have here. Then cover the mouth of the flask, tip it over for 1 second-ish, so the cloth get a bit soaked, and then run it across only the absolute edge of the acrylic on the exact spot where you will put the silicone. This stuff makes the acrylic very porous, which also drops the opacity of the acrylic in the spot where you apply it a ton. This is why you should only do it on the exact spot where you're going to silicone, to avoid getting not see-through acrylic. Now, I do want to say that this stuff can actually self-ignite after you use it on the cloth. So please keep the cloth close to you for about 2 hours or so it has time to evaporate and dry up. Siliconing the lip onto the glass is very straightforward. Just do remember that the silicone will not adhere to the acrylic where the primer was not applied. When that is done, wait again for 24 hours or so for it to fully cure, and you have yourself a dope setup for your ants. Nice. Alright, now it's all ready to put up on the shelf and get your ant colony moved in. But that will have to wait until the next part. Yes, I am very sorry to say, but this video is long enough as it is. Having them move in as well and the tube shortening in this video would be far too cramped in my opinion. You will simply have to keep an eye out for part 2. So why not subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified when that part is up. I really hope that you otherwise enjoyed this build, and I also hope to see what you make with this as inspiration. Please DM me what you make on my Instagram at ants_Scandinavia. I would really love to see. Well, that's it. Until next time, scavengers, have a great one. Bye!